All right, trickling in, that's great. Welcome tonight. It's my great pleasure to welcome Eric Höweler and Meejin Yoon, co-founders of Howeler Yoon Architecture and MY Studio. In more than one way, Eric and Meejin's exceptional and multidisciplinary practice embodies the post-disciplinary moment we might find ourselves in, with its incredible agility, intelligence, insight, talent, ingenuity, and creativity. Operating at the intersection of architecture, art, technology, and landscape, their ability to engage in thinking across scales is inspiring, not only because of the evenness in precision and creativity they are able to deploy, whether small or big, but because of their unique talent in weaving together architecture, interactive environments, interiors, installations, furniture, concept, clothing, and even artist books. The distinctiveness and quality of the work lies in the belief in architecture as an embodied and material experience, an architecture and work in general that has been widely recognized for its innovative and engaging use of material, of technology, and interactivity to create both intimate and epic experiences that transforms perception of public and private space. Amongst my favorite projects are the Bridge House, which was completed in 2014, a stunning and subtly radical private residence designed to accommodate 3 generations living together under one roof. Share Way from 2012, their visionary award-winning proposal for the Audi Urban Future Initiative, which imagines mobility in which city dwellers live free of car and home ownership. And the interactive installations Swing Time, also from 2014, and White Light, White Noise from 10 years earlier, which use light and sound to create immersive environments that activate public space. Howeler Yoon has received a number of awards, including the Audi Urban Futures Award, which I just mentioned, the United States Artists Award in Architecture and Design, the Architecture Record Design Vanguard Award, the Architecture League's Emerging Voice Award, and the Rome Prize Design in 2005. Parallel to their practice, Meejin and Eric are both committed to research, to scholarship, and to teaching. Eric received his Bachelor and Masters of Architecture from Cornell University and is a professor of architecture at Harvard University Graduate School of Design. Meejin received a Bachelor of Architecture from Cornell University and her Masters of Architecture and Urban Design from Harvard. She was awarded a Fulbright Fellowship to Korea in 1998 and is a professor at MIT, and since 2014 has become the head of the Department of Architecture as chair. Together, they fuse criticality and imagination, achieving a kind of deep and playful inquiry in their work that is really inspiring. And so tonight, I'm really excited to see old and new projects. And before welcoming them, I just also wanted to mention that Eric Bunge will be giving the response. So please welcome Meejin Yoon and Eric Höweler.
Thanks, Mal. Thanks for that wonderful introduction. It's nice. Can you hear me all right? It's nice to be back in New York. It's nice to be back in this room. We used to come here a lot in the mid-'90s when we were sort of working in New York, and this is where we came for ideas. So it's nice to be here ourselves. The title of the talk is Going Public, and that title, we picked it because we're trying to find a way to talk about the work, and the public dimension of the work is one thing that ties it all together. Strictly, going public means it's a kind of market condition. It's a kind of announcement of a public offering, which is about speculation. It's about futures, I guess, but it doesn't really sort of signal what we really want to talk about, which is a kind of shift from the private to the public. A kind of attention to publicness. And within architecture, we might say that part of the work is actually to define or delimit the extent of private and public space. But there's no singular public either, and so we're constantly working to sort of define a kind of multiple public, a kind of multiple audience for the work. And that's one of the things that I think we hope to show tonight. New urban forms, new spaces sort of produce new publics and new public personas. We like to talk about the flaneur, the pickpocket, the window shopper, but also the groper, new kind of urban personalities. And when we think about public today, we also think about devices. You know, technology is sort of an interface that like it's never been before. And how does that reconstitute a kind of sense of the public realm? It's different from Haussmann's Paris all of a sudden. But still the public is a space of the unexpected. It's a space of maybe unwanted attention. Whether as an individual or as a collective, the public forms its own sort of behaviors, its own patterns, its own rules. And rules are sometimes explicit and defined, and sometimes they're implicit, whether they're culturally defined, whether it's written on the wall, or written with walls. And we think about architecture as somehow inscribing, defining flows, providing shelter, creating conditions in the public realm that have effects and side effects, like the side effects that produced the removal of this Richard Serra piece in 1989.
One of our favorite pieces is The Following by Vito Acconci. And in this piece, it's a conceptual art piece where he simply remaps the city by a set of instructions which designate that you should follow a stranger in public space until they enter a private space. And this performance is repeated, and it's done in a way which remaps the city and brings to one's attention these like limits between public and private. So we're going to show a few really old projects and then some recent projects. But the first one is called The Defensible Dress. And when I arrived at MIT in 2001 to teach, I was very nervous because MIT has this T, the technology, in its name, and I'm, you know, very technophobic, a little technophilic, but mostly technophobic. And so when I arrived there, I took a course called How to Make Almost Anything, which is taught at the Media Lab. And my final project for the course was this hacked together garment, which you could program your kind of comfort level in terms of your personal space, distance, and whenever anyone intruded on that space, it would lift up. And the kind of medium by which this happened was through basically soldering and sewing, and I used shape memory alloys, nitinol wires at the time, which when they were given electric charge and heated, it created a contraction, which then created that kind of lever action. So this idea of the kind of public and personal response to space led to, and that technological little experiment led to a project in 2004 called White Noise, White Light. And the project was very simple, like the defensible dress. The idea was to simply create a field that would respond to the movement of people through that field. It would be indexical, it would emit white light, it would brighten, and white noise. And for me, the notion of white was really important in that it dealt with the accumulation of the crowd, accumulation of all colors in spectrum, and all sound within the range of human hearing. Which you can't hear. So the idea was that the field was essentially an infrastructure that had its own very simple set of rules. And as the public moved through it, they would begin to choreograph the field, and it would never repeat because the public engagement would, of course, always be different. And one of the things that was unexpected, because those two clips were staged the night before it opened, but one thing that was unexpected was that the piece didn't work the way I imagined because nobody left the field. They just stayed in the same place. And I think for us, these public projects have always been a kind of test in public space to see really how the public does engage it. So during the day, you were very conscious of the sound. The light was transmitted through these fiber optic stalks, and people would congregate in this field in very different ways and take ownership of that condition. And back then, in 2004, we had to solder everything by hand. We were our own sweatshop at the time, putting together 400 of these units, one by one. And what was so interesting is that a year later, the Arduino board came out and game over, and it launched this incredible maker culture that we have seen, a decade of since today. In thinking about kind of public space, I think it's always very context specific. And we were given an opportunity as a part of a transportation project, a Percent for Art program that was tied to a transportation project in Phoenix, Arizona, where there was a plan to shrink the road and to make Phoenix more pedestrian-friendly by adding bike lanes and public space. And what was really interesting was we were asked to transform a traffic median into a kind of public space in the context of Phoenix, Arizona, which is a very challenging problem. But, I remembered seeing photographs of this giant flag in Mexico City and how amazing it was that everybody lined up in this line of the shadow of the flag. And it seemed that in the context of Phoenix, maybe the most appropriate way or the most potentially successful way to create public space might simply be to create shade. So the idea was to take this notion of a kind of private parasol and turn it into a public parasol. The unit was really simple. It was just a strip folded in on itself like a Mobius strip. But what was important about the unit was that it would create shade, but also shadow, and that the shadow could frame light as it poured through the cell at different times of the day. So it would be a kind of porous shade structure aggregated together. The other thing that was critical to it was that it would be kind of responsive to the environment, specifically in the longitude and latitude in which it was sited. And so in really hot parts of the day, it's more in shade, and in the cooler parts of the day, there's more dappled light. And then, of course, the process of iterating between material efficiency and, of course, structural efficiency as well, and trying to find the right geometry and unit to reduce the tonnage of steel, because we were originally over budget, and we had to find ways to reduce the steel almost 50% in tonnage. So this is our fabricator in Phoenix doing our first mock-up. And then we recently opened it to the public this summer in one of the hottest days of the Phoenix summer. The top has a few solar panels so that it can light at night and attract the public in the cooler hours of the evening. And one thing that's important about public works is when you turn it over, you completely turn it over. And despite everything you can try to do, there's always, people who use your public space in the way they want to, which is this skateboarder here, which we like, but of course the city, has reservations about using public art for recreational activities.
So shifting gears a little bit, we talk about sort of defining discrete boundaries between public and private. A private house is one of the most sort of clear sort of inscriptions of a kind of public and private realm. But we were asked to do a house, and the thing that was most striking about it was this view, the view beyond the house, the view kind of through the house. And our thought was maybe we should just frame that view, and that would be sort of enough, or at least not to sort of prevent that. So we imagined a house for 3 generations that would actually consist of 4 windows or 4 rooms, 4 rooms looking at the landscape beyond. The first little study model showed a house sort of perched on this slope with a very defined zone sort of running through the middle, and that was meant to be a kind of public zone that would sort of run right through to sort of preserve that view, that approach right through the house, right past it into that private panorama. So the first sketches, this was actually done in 2005, and the house went on hold in 2008, and it came back in 2012 or so. But the form stayed the same. It's 2 volumes, master bedroom on the left, 3-car garage, and family and living room on the right, with that kind of zone down the middle, which is open, kind of space of display, a space of view. It's a view corridor. Our client sort of restarted the project and tore down the house, and then he called us and said, "Oh, we're starting again." There he is, Mr. Chung. And he took on this project on his own. He became his own general contractor, which is quite an interesting process to go through because we then became cast as assistants to the general contractor who didn't know how to build a house. So these were the early renderings in 2005. We did sort of manage to get it going. Very simple wood framing with only a few pieces of steel to make it affordable. And then a few sort of key details. If the house is simply 3 volumes, one stacked on the other 2, then the articulation of those volumes became important. And we really wanted the volumes to sort of conceal their dimension with a kind of knife-edge detail, which would actually shade in the summer and allow light in the winter. And because he was his own contractor, we were able to source things in creative ways that maybe a more conventional contractor would have said no. So we were able to convince him to do this knife-edge detail, which creates a kind of surprising condition as you move around the house. You're not sure how big it is or how thick it is or what it's made of. And we also found a contractor, a subcontractor, who was willing to sort of break aluminum, anodized aluminum, to create a custom facade of a kind of rain screen condition that we were able to install for a reasonable budget. But the most impressive thing about the house is the view out. Simply framing that view, actually the most impressive is without the glazing. But our objective was not to screw that up. So we tried to build a house in such a way that the view was the dominant condition. At the end of the day, we managed to build the house a little bit over budget, but still at an extremely affordable price for a guy who, at the outset, didn't have any kind of architectural ambitions. He simply wanted something maintenance-free. So we pitched it. We actually helped him a lot to get it done. And we managed to preserve that one thing, which was that when you approach the house, and you should look at the buildings on both sides of this house. There's a McMansion on the left, there's a McMansion on the right, and all of a sudden there's this incredible sort of viewfinder of a house that sort of preserves that view right through it, giving anyone who drives by a kind of fleeting glimpse right through the house and back out through the woods. So in a way, it sort of negotiates this kind of public-private condition, whether it's a house for an exhibitionist or a house for a nature lover, someone who values that sort of panoramic view is still to be decided. But there are moments in the house where you're not quite sure if you're inside or outside. You're somewhere in between public and private, and that's the final effect. A couple years ago, we also did a project for the Boston Society of Architects, which was a competition, and they asked for some way that this private institution for architects could open up to the public. And that was a real challenge because their space was all on the second floor. And the project was meant to be an interiors project. So we said, how do we make a public interface if we're only doing an interior and it's all on the second floor? So highly inaccessible. So our first idea was, well, maybe we should do something bright on the ceiling so that the ceiling becomes a kind of facade from the street. And if that ceiling comes down to the ground and it becomes, in a way, the signage, then that's the way people will sort of pay attention to this thing. And it was a competition we entered, we won, we managed to execute. The stair became the means of access, but also its sort of main billboard and its main facade, and it became, in a way, the ceiling. So that was the big move, this kind of figural stair, which we proposed in the rendering, to have no material no thickness. In reality, it's a 3/4 inch steel plate that's been welded and ground. We couldn't find anyone in Boston to build it, so they built it in Michigan, and they drove it to Boston, and they just put it through the window like a ship in a bottle. And it went in a day. They just sort of put it in there, bolted it together, really sort of tight clearances. It was 13 tons of steel that sort of fit in there. And you can see the crane doesn't have anywhere to go. It's tied up against the beam. It's up against the column. It's a miracle it fit. We were surprised. There it is. It's the main figure in the space. And for the Boston Society of Architects, remember, this is a membership organization with 4,000 architects. So we have 4,000 architects as your clients. And they have lots of ideas. They're like, well, maybe you should make it green. Maybe it should be blue. You know, who knows? It did sort of function. It was sort of beautiful the way it sort of went in. We had all kinds of code constraints. You might be wondering, well, how did you get away without the riser? There's a riser there. It's just glass. It's bolted on the back. But the Society of Architects knows how to get variances. So we got a variance for the landing requirement. We got a variance for the riser requirement. But at the end of the day, it sort of sits in the space, and it occupies the space without filling it up. It's visually open and transparent, making that gallery, I think, quite inviting. And there it is at night. Upstairs, the stair goes up, and it folds over and sort of spreads out as a ceiling, and that ceiling defines the gallery spaces. We thought it was important that the galleries occupy the edge, and that people coming to see something in the gallery would actually run into people that were in the meeting spaces. So it was a question of sort of mixing audiences as well. We found the only thing to exhibit that actually matched the stair here. And so here's the stair coming up. It folds over. It becomes a desk for working. It becomes a ceiling in the gallery. And this is something that sort of distributes people in the space, allowing them from the gallery to look out at the city. And that was important, that the Boston Society of Architects wants to put on display the kind of paraphernalia of design, that in the gallery you could see the city outside and see the kind of way the city's made on the inside. So it was an argument about putting that sort of on display. And at the end of the day, it sort of works. You know, from the street you look up, you see all this activity, you see light, the color, which we had in the renderings and somehow just stuck. It is what attracts you to the space, and it is what sort of makes you want to go up there and discover what's going on.
Another public project we did, which public is in quotes because it's not really clear if it's public, but it is a project that we got kind of out of the blue, and it happened right after the Chengdu or the Sichuan earthquake, and our client was in Chengdu at the time. And we received an email, and the email was very opaque, and it had this attachment with it. And I don't know, many of you might be getting emails from China, but we tend not to believe these are real. So the email essentially said, "Dear architect, we're looking for an architect, and you'll be part of this group. You'll be one of 7 architects to design a clubhouse." And we simply didn't respond. But it happened 3 more times. They sent the email, and finally we got a phone call, and we realized that it was probably real. And we were told that we've been assigned Site G, which is this very odd site, and we looked at the site plan. We thought it was an isometric, but it turns out it's a plan. It's not an isometric. But the project came with a few rules or a few requirements. One was that the client was very insistent that the project be based on a traditional courtyard house typology, that it deal with the traditional materials, local materials on site, that we had to do a sloped roof, and the design had to speak to a poem by Li Bai about ascending a mountain. So again, we thought this was very curious, and we dutifully looked at a lot of courtyard house typologies, and we couldn't get our head around actually doing a sloped roof. So we did sloped walls, and we thought maybe that could count as a sloped roof. But the idea became about simply packing a series of cellular spaces together into a kind of courtyard mat building typology, and creating a real variety of kinds of spaces within the clubhouse. So we went to China and we presented, and we realized that all the other architects who were from different areas in China were also having fun. And, and we got a really big scolding by the client, who were lucky. Instead of firing all of us on the spot, he actually sent us to the Suzhou Gardens. And he kept emphasizing that he was looking for something contemporary, but with real traditional Chineseness. And he kept using that term, Chineseness, and we weren't quite sure exactly what he meant, but we dutifully went to the Suzhou Gardens. He sent us to the Ermei Mountains. Eric woke up at 5 o'clock and, experienced ascending the mountain. And so we tried to redo the project in a more simplified way that tried to absorb some of the lessons learned by experiencing these places. And it's true, architecture can only be learned through, I think, the experience of inhabiting that architecture. So the program was more simply organized into work, play, and live. Each zone had different scale courtyards at the center of each of those cells. They were packed together and adjusted to that very, very awkward geometry that we were given in terms of the site plan. And then we dutifully, we were told we passed, great, and we dutifully did our construction documents and sent them off. And we didn't hear anything for many, many months, so we assumed, well, okay, that was that. Nice portfolio project. But then we got an email that said, with this attachment, that said that, congratulations, the project is under construction. And, just a few things to note. That we actually changed the site in the last few months. And we took your plans and we've mirrored your building and adjusted them to the new site. And we think it works. Could you please modify all your documents so that we can move forward? Because we've already cast the whole basement level for all the parking across the whole site. So there was our new site. So we said, sure. And in fact, we were really happy because the new site was better, and the geometry could be more simplified. And in fact, he also changed the program, so it went from a clubhouse to like a mega restaurant complex to finally an exhibition hall. And the circulation really worked well for that. But the interesting thing is there was no time to actually redo the construction documents. So what we did was we simply built, a few days ahead of them, our Rhino model. Literally, it was a Rhino model. We were just building all the beams and all the columns, alerting to them where the transfer beams should be. And we would send these every night. And they would literally build during the day. So the developer for this project had his own in-house structural engineering team and construction company, and so we were able to work this way without the documents. And the project was built. And one of the other interesting rules that we had been given was that we had to use small operable windows. And this building is 60,000 square feet. It's enormous. But then we were limited in terms of the window scale. So we we introduced these window surrounds, these giant window surrounds, to modify or mediate the scale between the operable window and then the kind of big brick facades. And these two were kind of modeled and sent as sketches kind of daily back and forth during the construction process. And the material is local gray brick, and you can see the color changes as the brick goes up, and that was not intentional. What happened was it's just such an enormous quantity of brick that as they were producing brick, the color just changed in the local factory over time, and so you're just seeing the darker shade as you move up. So the building is actually quite it's got a quite significant perimeter, and we wanted to create a lot of variation. The other thing that also happened is we originally designed these window surrounds in wood, but it turned out wood was too expensive, and so the client suggested the substitution of Corten steel. So we said sure, and it turned out quite well. And because the project is so large in terms of its perimeter, we wanted to make sure that all its multiple entries, it has many back doors and side doors, and is relatively porous, were really different. And so the idea of kind of packing in terms of plan was used in elevation as well to kind of signal the difference between the kind of smaller side doors, back doors, and then this was the main front door to the hall. And the last thing we were able to introduce was a simple tectonic idea. If we were going to use brick, we thought there should be a simple rule since following construction documents would be probably a challenge. So the rule was simply to be true to one's orientation. If you're a brick, what do you want to be? I want to be truly north-south or east-west. So all the bricks, even though the building has angles, the bricks are all true north-south or east-west, which creates the kind of variation in all the kind of angled parts of the building. So when you walk around it, you can see this different texture, but also this notion of orientation and where those angled walls happen.
So we did build that project. We did eventually get paid, and the same local architect invited us to do a competition for some high-rise residential buildings. High-rise buildings, residential buildings in Shanghai, imagine there's an incredible market for different kinds of residential buildings, and every building is trying hard to differentiate itself. We thought it might be interesting, instead of like trying to differentiate the overall form, we could differentiate the units, the actual units themselves. So instead of 320 repetitive unit types, we thought maybe we'll come up with some different unique unit types. And so a simple logic of like every floor has the same width, but it's divided into different numbers of units. That might produce a logic that would insist and guarantee a kind of range of unit types across the height of the building. And so the building has a kind of high density of units in the middle, and then it sort of decreases as you go up. So the penthouses are the big ones at the top. And this simple logic, we tried a few different versions, just trying to script it in different ways, but it seemed to produce these sort of bizarre sort of optical effects. We got weird curvatures and weird twisting simply by rearranging the units and sort of justifying them to the left or justifying them to the right. It seemed like a simple rule about the balcony might actually end up shaping the overall building. So rather than sort of post-rationalize or somehow cut and carve the building like so many of the kind of expressive forms in Shanghai, we sort of articulated the unit itself, and that produced, as a consequence of its organization, a kind of three-dimensional form that was kind of ugly, but actually had a certain amount of appeal because it was sort of self-generated. So the floor plates, they're all different. As you move up, we were given the core, so we were just working on the perimeter. And the idea that each unit had a balcony, and each balcony had one sort of blinder, and that they misaligned between floors produced these bizarre kind of curvatures, these bizarre optical effects, which we actually thought was kind of refreshing, that the building would be sort of formed by an internal organization logic. So these are the competition models. We sent them off. Again, it was like, well, when's the meeting? Well, we don't know. When's the meeting? We don't know. When's the meeting? It's in 12 hours. So we missed the presentation. We didn't win the project, but we felt it was such a strong idea that, somehow it helped us rethink the idea of kind of big buildings by thinking about them sort of part to whole, sort of inside out. So that was a kind of a learning process for us. I'm going to do this one. Okay. Amal referred to different kinds of projects. I mean, we wanted to show a range, so like bricks and lighting. And lights. We were invited to do a project at the Mexico-U.S. border in San Isidro. And the GSA, the General Services Administration, is the U.S. government. It's probably the biggest client you would ever work for. They were commissioning a new border crossing. Apparently, this is the most active border crossing between the U.S. and Mexico. It can take 6 hours to cross. And a lot of people actually cross once a day because they live in Mexico, they work in the States, and so they come across this border all the time. So I think they've got about 14 lanes currently, up to a 6-hour delay. So the U.S. government is rebuilding this with 24 lanes. And we were given this rendering. This was not by us. And they said, it's a canopy. We'd like you to do something site-specific. And so we said, maybe we'll just put an edge on that canopy. We'll make a screen that's 1 pixel high and 600 feet long. And the idea is every time a car goes through, we'll see a kind of a burst of light. Maybe we can sort of design a kind of light pattern such that as people are waiting to cross the border, there's some sort of signal, some sort of broadcast that says, yeah, the border is porous, there's movement, that people are coming across. And something that seems so simple, I think actually totally changes the experience of waiting for the border. So we worked with computer programmers, lighting designers, to think about how we could transform such a mundane sort of boundary condition into something that might create a kind of broadcast system, a kind of signalization that says, without language, it says, we're open, you're welcome, please come through. And this is particularly poignant today when we think about the rhetoric of borders and things. There's this idea that we need to sort of wall it all off, and there's a kind of hysteria around this. But I think this sort of very modest project that's 1 pixel high and 600 feet long sort of talks about a condition without using language, without using words, but says simply, movement is happening. And look at it. See how it's actually, the lived reality is different from the rhetoric that we hear in the news all the time. You want to talk about this? I'll keep going. Okay. So we are interested in these kind of broadcast mechanisms, how architecture functions as a kind of low definition sort of signal. We did a small competition in Boston. There's a new government building being built, the background. And the idea was to create a sculpture there that could be a kind of information sculpture, a kind of signal spire. And we said, how could we think about this as a map of the city of Boston? How could a kind of bundled structure convey the idea that there's 21 neighborhoods sort of working together kind of structurally? And how do we sort of map some sort of phenomena in this sculpture? So Boston has this kind of app on your phone, so if you see something, you can take a picture of it, report it to the city. It's called 311. If you see something, you say something, right? Take a picture of this, dangerous hydrant condition, report it to the city of Boston. It gets logged, it's geotagged, and presumably they fix it. They put this thing around it. But this idea that there's this data source out there that's constantly being updated. It's a very high quality data source. It's site specific. It's the kind of violation, the kind of condition. You can also say, nice work cleaning up the garbage or something. But you can say negative things, you can say positive things. But we took this data set and we said maybe we could sort of map that into the sculpture if we sort of unroll the sculpture. So we understand the sculpture as a kind of model of the city, and then working to sort of three-dimensionalize that data, we can create a kind of broadcast of the different events. And each event represents some citizen communicating something to the city of Boston. We also, from a fabrication point of view, we looked at the kind of forces and stresses in the steel, and we created a perf pattern that sort of mapped the different stresses. We sort of still do a lot of this kind of design build stuff, so we assembled these pieces ourselves, brought them to site, and installed them in front of this government building. And so people walk by and they're like, what is this thing? What does it do? What does it mean? And we say, well, this is an interface. This is citizens interacting with the city. And so there's a kind of normal mode of like, well, I've logged a request and I'm unhappy with the trash or this pothole. There's another mode. The client insisted that there be a kind of jackpot mode so that you could control it yourself. So this is also a kind of cautionary tale. It's like, we wanted to make this data visible. On the other hand, there's such a strong desire to sort of hijack any kind of broadcast medium and turn it into kind of entertainment. So the fact is, if you go there and you sort of do the kind of single spire hashtag, you'll sort of trigger a kind of site-specific response, which is this kind of jackpot mode. So we're still working on that. It's going to open this week, Friday, if you're in Boston. You're invited. There it is. Okay. One more? Okay. Okay. Amal mentioned the swings. We were invited by the MCCA, the Massachusetts Convention Center Authority, to help them design a temporary park. And this is in Southie. It's a kind of rough neighborhood. The convention center sits in a kind of wasteland. And they're trying to make a park in the middle of nowhere where there is nobody. So what do? We need to bring people here. We need to make it into a place. So we thought, how do you sort of bring people to a neighborhood? How do you sort of activate a space? How about something playful? How about this kind of defamiliarized sort of playground equipment, like big swings? The swings are made out of polypropylene, so they're luminous and diffusing. There's an accelerometer in each swing, so as it swings, it changes color. So it's blue and it's pink, and it's blue and it's pink. Very simple technology. So oversizing it, giving it a little bit of intelligence, produces an incredible behavioral shift. All of a sudden, adults are behaving like children, refusing to get off, and swinging madly. This is footage that we sort of staged. The fact is, it got completely overrun by people, discovering their inner youths. And it became such a kind of landmark in the neighborhood. I should also mention there's a bar right next to it. So that's how you make public space. You put a bar next to a swing set, and you invite them to sort of go at it. So this is us making things. We like to make things, little microcontrollers. And this year we actually decided to put a PV array over the top so that you don't need any power. The thing just sort of powers itself. The same sort of, it's a kind of 3D space frame. The same space frame actually creates the surfaces that orient towards the sun, so it's all the way off the grid. This year we made it blue to green. So it's off-grid, it's playful, and this is what it looks like on any sort of given sort of Friday night or Saturday night. Thousands of people mob it. In the tent is the bar, and they behave in ways you would not imagine. We said one person at a time, maybe two, no pushing. You can swing like this, don't swing like this, do not swing like this. I found someone swinging underneath this thing. He was hanging like this. So as much as we're interested in behavior, in building behavior and encouraging different kinds of social norms, we're always surprised by how people actually use these things. This guy, these girls, this guy. Lots of selfies. That's one way to measure success, is how many selfies people take. And, you know, nice things too. Okay, your turn.
Great. So we have 2 more projects to share. This project kind of walked in the door, and we thought it was a kind of a dream project. We were approached by the Circus Conservatory of America, who is planning the kind of first accredited university level, college level circus arts program in the United States. The site is Thompson Point, right when you enter Portland, Maine. And you know, you can see the site as you're driving across into Portland, and then from the site you're surrounded by water. It's really a kind of amazing, amazing site. The interesting thing about the program is that it's a combination of classrooms, but also training halls. And the training halls are, of course, very large and very specific to the kind of performance arts being practiced. And we were encouraged to look at the history of circus and circus arts, and we found these amazing advertisements of circuses that, you know, hybridize these words, trying to come up with an adequate description of this kind of program, which was really interesting to us. So the historical circus, what I think is really amazing, because it was nomadic, is very minimal, right? And the circus, or the circle for the circus, makes a lot of sense when you look at it. It's the kind of most compact form to get a lot of views intimately into the center. It has very minimal structure with one pole at the center. And we learned that the circus is based on this 42-foot diameter, which is, of course, based on how a horse can trot in that space. And what's interesting is that 42-foot diameter stays with us today, even in contemporary circus. These are all the circus plans for Cirque du Soleil's performances. So the idea of the circle, the idea of in the round, the idea of the body was kind of inspiring to reconnect with. So because the acts are very vertical, this is their current space on Thompson Point, we looked very carefully at all the kind of programmatic requirements that they had, and the client actually came to us with, you know, one sketch, and this was his sketch that he came to us with from The Little Prince. This idea of like a form that's draped over another form, and that's a hybrid working at multiple levels. So we went through a design process, and this will reveal that sometimes we have no idea what we're doing. And we, you know, just started iterating with the program and the site requirements, and we struggled a lot initially in terms of finding criteria to evaluate our formal exploration. And then we kind of took a step back and we said, you know, we kept fighting the circle. The client asked us to really consider a circle, and every time we tried it, it just never really seemed to work. And we resisted and resisted, and finally we gave in. But we gave in a way that didn't start with the form, literally, of a circle, but actually took the kind of very clear programmatic volumes and put them in the round to each other. With the kind of performance space at the ground level as a 42-foot diameter circle. So it arrayed the training halls around the center. It lifted them up, though it left the performance space, the public performance space at the ground level. And then it really privileged the views out so that when you were in these training halls, you could get this incredible vista of the water and the sky. And then the idea was on the interior, as the training volumes faced inwards, you would have this kind of more dense array and sensation. This is a Tricia Brown piece of other people training in that same kind of space. And so we put those ideas together, and then we connected them with a kind of public social space for the students, because we learned that many of the acts that they develop tend to be in the residual spaces that they inhabit. So we connected them through a kind of circulation, and then made sure that the ground level was always open and accessible to the public, so that they could have the ground and their view of the water as well. The last project I wanted to share, so if the circus was a kind of dream project for us, I think the last project I wanted to share was, I guess, the opposite of a dream project, a project you would never want. It is a project for Sean Collier, his memorial at MIT. So during the Boston Marathon bombings, Boston was really shook hard. But what was also pretty phenomenal was what happened immediately following the marathon bombings. The city voluntarily shut down. I mean, of course it was requested, but it was amazing that the citizens of the city all decided to stay inside during this incredible manhunt for the two brothers. And shortly thereafter, during the manhunt, a police officer at MIT was shot and killed right on the corner of the site during the brothers' escape. And after that event, there was an incredible outpouring for all the victims, of course, in Boston, but also specifically in the MIT community for Officer Sean Collier. And these ad hoc memorials formed, and this is one of the most beautiful hacks on MIT's campus. The night of the first year anniversary of his shooting, the students created this beautiful installation of thousands of cranes hanging from Frank Gehry's data center lobby. So the question of how we memorialize in a condition of kind of oversaturated media, where displays are ubiquitous, I think was something that I was thinking about at the time. And MIT did something very MIT, which is it asked the community for suggestions, and then convened a committee to think about how we should memorialize Sean Collier. And there were all kinds of ideas from the community, and it brought up the whole issue about memorials and representation and figurative and literal, and the committee concluded that it should be a physical memorial, although there was some debate, like maybe it should be an ephemeral memorial, it should be a scholarship. But they really wanted a physical memorial, and they wanted it on the site in which he was shot. And the conclusion of that committee report recommended that one of their own, so someone from MIT, designed the memorial and recommended that I do that. So I was, when I received the call from the provost, I was not sure really how to handle it, because, the history of the Vietnam Memorial, and I think, it's my own campus. I thought it was going to be a very challenging project to do. But I was encouraged to try, and so I was asked to synthesize this 100-page document of all of the community ideas for the memorial, and to find a way to create something that was uniquely MIT. And the one thing I could hold on to that was abstract and collective enough was this notion of MIT strong, Boston strong, and 179 was his badge number. So this idea of strength and how to convey strength became interesting to the project, or critical, I would say, to the project. So that's the site where Sean was shot, and it's between the Koch Cancer Research Center and Frank Gehry's giant data center. And so I decided to remove this planter, which had a few nice trees, but to use that as the location of the memorial. And one of the things that kept coming up in meeting after meeting and was this idea of an American flag. And the committee, which consisted of police officers and students and faculty, they really wanted an American flag, and sometimes many American flags on this site. So the question was, how could we abstract that and use the figure maybe of the star, but do it in a way that could be spatial, so not a barrier, but something that would have a kind of void or an absence that was always recognized as part of the form. So the five-pointed figure, you can argue it represents a star. It could also represent a hand, which is part of MIT's motto of hand in mind. But really, it's simply a five-pointed figure that frames the site, that frames very specific views of the site and creates a space of memory in this kind of void underneath. And then this is the view to the location where Sean was shot, that red rock that you can see. And then I wanted to be quite literal about this idea of strength, that, this Inca wall, which I think is really amazing, where every block is super unique and they each hold each other up. And so it was very important that the memorial be a fully compressive structure, and that its geometry and physics, essentially made the project strong, that every block supported each other in this configuration. And of course, there's a big challenge in building fully compressive structures today. We had many structural engineers on the project. We worked with Nippers Helbig. We worked also with John Oxendorf, who's a masonry consultant. And the question was, could you really build a fully compressive masonry structure today? And some of the engineers wanted to post-tension it, and so by putting steel cables in it, it could resolve all the lateral problems. But in the end, we felt that it had to be literally strength through each of those blocks working together. And so, simple principles of an arch, it's basically a five-way arch with each arch supporting each other, which is pretty straightforward. But then we wanted to create this impossibly flat vault underneath. And the forces resolve themselves in this strange pentagon. So one of the challenges of building this structure is that there's a kind of 1-to-6 ratio. So for every movement or deflection, if it moves 1 inch out, it's going to move 6 inches down. So that's that catastrophic red color right there. And in today's building industry, asking masons to meet what we needed in terms of our tolerance criteria, which was under 3 millimeters total, so basically 1.5 millimeters per block is the level of tolerance we needed, was a real challenge. And then, but somehow everyone agreed that it was worth the tests and worth going through the process of seeing if we could design and engineer it as a fully compressive structure. So John's team developed a little applet for us, which allowed us, as we were designing, to calculate the weight. And so this is the force line. And so every time that red line comes out of the volume, it fails here. And every time it terminates before the 1/3 point of the last block, it also fails. So we were able to use this tool to kind of modify the geometry according to all the parameters on site, and then divide the form into 32 blocks. The blocks come from a quarry in Virginia, close to West Virginia. It's kind of amazing, the amount of volume of materials and tonnage of stone. And each of the blocks weighs somewhere between, some of the smallest is about 7,000 pounds, and the largest block weighs about 22,000 pounds. And we were able to, just by having our laptop there, utilize and select blocks that might have fractures or imperfections for kitchen counters, but work quite well for the memorial. And again, we couldn't find many people who were willing to fabricate this for us. So we ended up working with Chorus Stone out in Wisconsin. And they had basically the right equipment, so we needed CNC saws because the process was literally a subtractive one, that we were going to just be removing material and carving these blocks of stone. And some of these blocks take about 7 days, running 24 hours, these machines, to carve. So we thought, we have all the tools available to us. We have computer models, we have CNC machines. This will be a piece of cake. Well, it had some challenges. One of the ones that we weren't so aware of initially, but the fact that we use material to carve material, right? So these blades would actually wear, so you can imagine that, over the course of 7 days, 24 hours a day, the saw blades themselves would wear, which meant that there was always going to be an imperfection between the computer model and, of course, the final blocks. And so we had to develop a kind of quality control system, our own version of the shop drawing process, basically that measured every point to every point when the block was finished. And then if we were, over, a certain metric, we used 2 millimeters over or under, we would make an adjustment in the next block, and it would kind of run in sequence like that. So the memorial is about 190 tons of stone, and it sits on 35 piles that go about 40 feet below grade. And what you're seeing right here is a major duct bank at MIT. This is where all the power and data come into the university. And of course, we have 190 tons sitting on it. So everyone is really, really sensitive, of course, to this site and any concern for deflection. And we were able to develop kind of techniques. There are some small steel dowels for lateral redundancy. And because, again, our computational models in structural engineering are very biased towards steel construction, we were not able to calculate and simulate, so we had to do a lot of our own testing in the civil engineering lab about how much compressive strength there was in these blocks and then the grout between them. The steel in the foundation is pulling it back together, and these are just some of the blocks as they would come kind of in sets of 3 from the fabrication facility in Wisconsin to MIT every couple of weeks. That's the keystone coming in, and it snowed 109 inches that winter. But what's interesting about this project for us was that it was always a test. It was always an experiment. So what you can see down here are these giant 10,000-pound scales. And the reason there are scales is because we installed on top of the scaffold, assuming a certain rate of deflection and compensating for that, but not 100% sure where that deflection would or what the number of that deflection would be. And so every joint had a strain gauge associated with it. And then the top of these scaffold points would allow us to turn and lower the memorial by a fraction of a millimeter every time. So that's the strain gauge. And then it was sitting on these giant scales which were hooked up to a computer and measuring as we lowered the scaffold. And what was amazing was it took, I don't know how many hours? 8 hours. And 30 people, like, turning these dials, like a fraction of a rotation. 8 hours to see this thing not move at all, which was the huge success of the project. So it did move about 6 millimeters. 96% of the loads were transferred into the legs, and then we grouted, and the subcontractors and masons were so excited to finally stand under this structure that they had been working on for many months through the most brutal of winters. The exterior is thermal finish, so it's lighter in color and rough, and then underneath it's polished. Not quite polished, but high honed, so it has a little bit of reflectivity, and then that parabolic curvature really plays with sound, so when you're underneath it and you talk, it kind of echoes and rolls down. There's the 5-pointed figure. There are a series of point lights in the ground plane, and it's very porous and used now kind of as a kind of everyday space at MIT. And what's interesting is it's very open from certain vantage points, but also can feel very intimate. And there's only 2 places of text, one under the dome, and then the second location is in the 2 arms facing where Sean was shot. And a simple quote from Sean's brother, "Live long like he would, big hearts, big smiles, big service, all love." And it is kind of remarkable how the community received it, but also the kind of extended community of police officers all across the state.
Okay, so we said we're going to go public, trying to find a framework to sort of talk about all this diverse work. What does it mean to go public or to have gone public? What does it mean to define a public? Our sense is that the public is not something that's residual. It's not a leftover. It's not what happens after the buildings are all done with what's left. I think it's something that needs to be designed sort of actively. And publics, the members of the public, need to be actively designed as well, whether we're trying to encourage them to behave in a certain way or encouraging them to meet at certain places. As we talk about the work, we talk about public interfaces, and increasingly we think that architecture is becoming more and more about interfaces, whether it's simply a window or a screen, whether it's a display, or whether it's a place where you actually want people to interact. Architecture is becoming more sophisticated, more like a display. So we use the terms of display to talk about architecture. We talk about its content. We talk about its inputs, its outputs. And we thought it's interesting to think about, we talk about graphic user interfaces, like GUIs, like keypads and mice. But more we want to talk about spatial user interfaces. And I think that's one interesting way to think about architecture is not graphic user interfaces, not sort of static interfaces, but graphic or spatial user interfaces where people are interacting with each other. So in a way, that's asking a lot of architecture to sort of define these conditions, to encourage users to treat their forms like interfaces. And that's one thought we wanted to leave you with, was instead of talking about like form, we wanted to talk about codes, behavioral codes. And instead of talking about a passive occupant, we wanted to talk about users. So an architecture that positions its occupants as users. That's it. Thank you.
If there are 2 Erics on the outside, it'll be symmetrical. I think that's why Amal asked me to ask him questions. So thank you for the fantastic lecture. You left us with a couple of very challenging thoughts, and maybe the last one you just left us with, Eric, is really about users, and the idea also that there are maybe misusers too that don't abide by your behavioral codes a little bit. But one thing you said earlier too is about how we can create that new spaces create new publics, right? And I was thinking about the title of your lecture, which is Going Public, but it could also be serious play in a way that you balance rigor with freedom. And I think one of your sort of agendas is to connect the personal to the public and sort of bypassing the private, right? Which brings me to a memory I have maybe 7 years ago when you parked in Cambridge with your car and opened the trunk, and I saw the earlier version of the model of your courtyard house. And I remember Meejin sort of brushing it aside saying, oh, the client just, said no to this project. And so I wanted to ask you about this sort of idea of, in a way, as I see it, serious play, and maybe for our students, if you could speak a little bit about the role of different modes of research and testing and sort of iterations in the way that you introduce innovation in your work. And one sort of lesson I thought, for me anyway, was to think about the brick having a compass that at a certain level there can be a very simple set of instructions that are not the result of laborious scripting, but a kind of a very simple behavioral rule for the brick. So can you talk about innovation in relationship to freedom and play, and maybe also to instructions, if you will? How do we convey innovation to create built work, essentially?
That's a great question for Meejin.
I think one of the reasons I started with Vito Akanchi's piece is because it, again, has a very simple rule set, but the context is so, the context being the city, is so rich that that simple rule set will always create variation and opportunity and the unexpected. And like a Solowit wall drawing, it can have the same rules, but in each different context play out completely differently. And I think we've always been attracted to that mix of something simple that could create something rich that would then make you a little bit more aware of your context and the relationship between public and private.
But I showed that kind of ugly tower in Shanghai, or the two ugly towers in Shanghai. I think that was a moment for us where we really sort of surrendered a little bit to the idea of the form not being preconceived, to saying, let's set up some rules and see what happens. I think that was a real eye-opener. There's a few moments where you really have a kind of eureka, and we realized that by setting up some rules and tweaking the rules, we could control a kind of outcome within a certain limit. And so I think the worst thing that could happen in China or in Dubai or whatever is, architects are given total freedom. There's no constraints at all, and I think that's when we freak out and make some, stupid ideas. But if we can think of, the kind of internal logics of residential identity, personalized, units, maybe organized into a framework of ideas that has a certain logic, it can produce a kind of whole lot of the parts. And maybe you wouldn't like the way it looks, but I thought it was a kind of giving into this rule-based system. And it was such a moment of discovery for us. Even though we didn't win, it was one of our favorite projects. And we were like, oh, let's show it, because I think it does exemplify this, almost this sort of game play. Design is serious gameplay. Set up the rules, play them, and then assess the outcome.
And it seems that your approach in many of your projects, I would say until the Collier Memorial, where I want to point out maybe a shift, the relationship between the part of the whole through this sort of systemic or behavioral logic is always in play, that in a way you have started very often with the part, subjected to certain rules and certain constraints. But I think at the Collier Memorial there's an interesting shift where there's still a relationship between the part and the whole tectonically in terms of the resolution of forces and things like that, the joints. But at this, really the rules are much more emerging from sort of the concept of this void, right, and maybe the urban experience. Can you talk about how you can see maybe this sort of new direction in your work scaling up?
I think you're right to point to a shift there. That was a kind of very willful subtraction. I think in other projects we try to avoid that kind of willful form making in order to find an internal logic. For the Collier Memorial, it was very clear that it needed to be a kind of a very conspicuous absence. And so we had to design that sort of figure that was just so. And that was much more willful, much more, we made 1 million models it was hard to tell the difference between them because they were just little tweaks, you know. So at the end of the day, each piece is unique. There was an incredible labor of sort of cataloging and you know, because we would have previously, I think, thought about, well, what's the kind of rational, economical, optimal way to do this and get maximum expression with minimum means. This one, I think we did sort of give in to a kind of desire to make form for maximum effect. But I'm not sure it's a total paradigm shift. I mean, I think we could easily just sort of fall back into a different set of rules. I think you're right that there was it was a lapse.
But it's interesting to compare it maybe to the circus, which, by the way, what's happening to that project? You kind of shifted very quickly.
We're applying for funding. We're trying to help the client fundraise.
But it's funny how you, Meejin, kind of defended the circle as the result of like rolling up, you know, the program, not as a kind of original, you know, departure point, which I guess you also described the program as sort of fixed, like a series of volumes that had to be, you know, the way they had to be, and then everything else kind of, you know, gets sutured in between. I see a relationship between, you know, that larger project maybe and smaller installations which have their sort of constituent parts and then kind of, you know, adapt in a way. Can you talk a little bit about the scale, which Amal mentioned at the beginning, which is the scale of your work? I mean, you have a practice that, you know, spans many scales, many geographic locations, spans a disciplinary kind of, you know, many disciplinary kind of conditions. And there seems to be an inversely proportional relationship between the scale of your work and its location too, except for the circus at some level too. But in terms of scale, how are your approaches, maybe, how do you see different projects relative to scale in terms of your approach? You know, how do you, like, do you notice a distinction, let's say, between the way you go about projects relative to their very different scales?
Well, you know, the towers came right after the courtyard house, you know, and so the idea of organizing bricks and organizing units, I mean, there's a kind of almost a uncanny sort of resemblance of like the brick wall and the tower. So in a way, you know, we said, well, let's, you know, treat the residential units as bricks and array them in the same way. I do think the question of scale requires a kind of assessment of what's appropriate, you know, and, you know, in Dubai you do one thing, in China you do another thing. In Boston, you do something else, and it has to do, obviously, with the site specifics, the situation that you're working in. And that's one thing that we haven't had a consistent vocabulary. I think there's no formal consistency. There might be a kind of interest in organizational or rule-based principles. But we always want to be sort of open to think about what's appropriate and what's possible at those scales, what material is appropriate, what, you know. I think it is hard to scale up, you know, starting with a defensible dress, you know, one microcontroller, you know, controlling a behavior, and then taking that to the scale of a building obviously doesn't work, but we like to think that there's an approach to the kind of part to whole, there's an approach to sort of embedding intelligence into the unit that can scale up, you know, so, you know, we keep saying we're waiting for that project where we can converge a kind of interest in behavior, sort of in a kind of active architecture, at the scale of a building. We're still waiting for that email or that phone call. But I guess we'll figure that out when we get there.
I was looking at your work. There was a kind of a continuous thread, which is clearly, you know, in the title, which seems to be kind of an ideological position about the public and about, you know, turning even opportunities that are, you know, on the face of it, private, you know, that have a private scope into a public experience at whatever cost. I wonder if there's a connection between that for you and the notion of expanded practice, which is the title of your last book, which I picked out of our shelves again to sort of prepare. And by the way, it's incredible how much has happened since 2008 and how many of those renderings in the book are now here, so that's really exciting to see. One could say that expanded practice is maybe a zeitgeist of our generation, or that it's just an opportunistic set of, you know, conditions that we just have to appropriate all the time. But my sense is that for you, maybe it's not just a question of affinity and formation, like taking a course at MIT, like how to build anything. There is a kind of political agenda that has to do maybe with turning every project into something that connects to the public, and then therefore having sort of, you know, feeling empowered to take on any project. Why do you have so many projects of different scales, and how do you connect that to the idea of expanded practice?
Why do we have so many projects? You know, I think I'd say the reason we have projects at so many different scales is because we haven't actively tried to define what kind of practice we are, other than we're kind of practice of our generation that is interested in speculating at every given opportunity. And I mean, I think if we were in a position where we had 10 building projects, I think you'd see probably, you know, a more consistency of scale. But in all of the time to get to our first building commissions, I think we just took every public art opportunity, every furniture opportunity, every clothing opportunity to test architectural ideas at a different scale and different medium.
But I think, Eric, the kind of generational question I think that's in there is, you know, what is it about our generation that is so determined to build at all costs and in any medium, at any scale? I do think that's something that binds us together in a way. I think, you know, we inherited some digital tools. We've found ways to use them. We didn't grow up with them. I think there's a difference between the kind of post our generation, the pre our generation. I think we have, you know, taken on things that maybe other generations wouldn't have. But I think it comes from a kind of intense desire to put something in the world and to test it and to see how people react to it. And I think that's why we would do a dress or a landscape or a building. And I think increasingly we're getting opportunities to work at an architectural scale, which makes us somehow relearn in a way how we were trained. I mean, the expanded practice was a means to try to sort of come to terms with this crazy body of work. How do we theorize that? Maybe we need to expand the definition of what architecture is. You know, a dress is architecture, a chair is architecture, a proposal for PS1 is architecture. You know, those are all kind of expanded. I think it's not just us. I think there's other people in this room who would I think take on that same sort of desire for practice at all costs.
What's your reading of Amal's introduction when she described you as operating in a post-disciplinary time? Maybe I should be asking Amal. Because you engage with many disciplines and you clearly have trespassed.
Yeah. We like that very much. We like to be trespassers. I mean, we like to say that they're all architecture. You know, that's a convenient way to do it. You know, lighting design, programming, landscape. In a way, they're all architectural. And that way we can sort of give ourselves license to trespass into other disciplines, because sometimes there's something quite fertile in other disciplines. I think trespassing into lighting and computer control, I think, was one early way to sort of launch a practice that had to do more with interactivity. I feel like there were certain lighting designers that sort of didn't like that. You know, when we won awards for projects, the lighting designers say, well, we were the lighting designers. Like, well, what were we? We were the ones who came up with that thing that occupied the public realm that made this project sort of interesting. So it's tricky to find a title for that. Sometimes it's useful to be an architect. Sometimes it's useful to be a public space.
Yeah, but I think it's, you know, we take the definition of an architect and architecture pretty broadly, and I would say that architecture is about setting up relationships and constructing relationships and defining relationships. And if you say it that broadly, then maybe we are kind of post-disciplinary in order to set up those relationships that now kind of exceed what historically were limited to the architect.
Mm-hmm. Although one can think of many historic examples, including in the Bauhaus, of, you know,
exactly.
architects who made, you know, costumes. For instance. One last question before we open it up to the public. The categories in your last book were envelopes, natures, formats, interactions, and media. Would you change those? Or have any?
I forgot about those categories. They do seem like good ones, though. I think I might stick with them. I think they still apply. Maybe we could add some. I don't know. I would add interfaces. That's my new word.
Maybe that's enough for everything.
Yeah.
Thank you. We'll open up to questions from the audience. I think we have a microphone, which I don't see. Does somebody? Oh, they're right there. There's one over there.
Are all the planes of the memorial just flat surfaces that are in compression, or do you have some backup in case there's any slippage from the Boston winters that are just horrendous up there?
Yeah, so there are 54 dowels that are about 3/8 of an inch by a foot.
There are alignment dowels.
Yeah.
If there is any slippage, the steel pin will resist that slippage. So the dowels are slipped, so there's not any tension in them, but they do create alignment to handle any deflection or any slippage that might happen.
Was the color of the stone important, or was it more the mechanical properties of the stone that determined what you selected?
It was both. I think we wanted a really dense stone, and then I wanted the color to be pretty neutral, so it's gray.
But it also has veins in it. There's a kind of feathery vein in it, and we wanted to make sure that as the stone turned, you would actually be able to see a figure turn the corner. So it's cubic, it's three-dimensional. We wanted to see that three-dimensionality. If it was a uniform gray granite, you'd never know it was solid because you'd assume that it was just sort of veneered. So the idea of a figured stone of a neutral color that would express its three-dimensionality was important. Thomas.
One there and one there as well.
Thanks for the presentation. It's lovely work. One way of theorizing the body of work is on this axis of public and private, and being public and private, and being private and public, and the sort of interfaces that generates. Another way of theorizing the work, and one that I'm interested in its meaning to you, is an axis of heaviness and lightness. Because on the one hand, there's this extraordinary and unbearable lightness to the work of a point and a line and a point of light and the way that diffuses into a field and this kind of radical immateriality of it. On the other hand, there's work that's very heavy, literally and metaphorically. There's the 13 tons of steel in the staircase and obviously the memorial and all the weight that carries. Immateriality, hypermateriality, lightness, and heaviness. I wonder how that comes in as you think about this work.
I mean, I think one of the things that we always try to do is create something that feels uncanny or unfamiliar. And so even with the Collier Memorial, there was a lot of debate about what that thickness should be in terms of the block of stone at the top, wanting it to feel clearly like it's working as masonry and doesn't have, cable in it, but at the same time wanting it to feel impossibly thin too, as a impossibly flat and impossibly thin as a dome. So I think we're always kind of playing that game.
But I do think, sometimes people come and they say, oh, we expect something to be lit or something to be interactive or something, and so that was a certain mode of working with the kind of broadcasting of architecture. I think the memorial is really it is completely different. It's so massive.
But I think it was unexpected. I mean, I think when the committee asked that I do the memorial, in their mind, I was selected because of white noise, white light, because of these ephemeral structures. But through that community process, the committee process, and I think that's why there is a shift, that it was very hard to escape the kind of figure and the metaphor of the figure in communicating and talking about the memorial. So it is an interesting intersection between forces that typically don't align.
I think we had two questions over there.
I'd like to know, when you have these digital tools in the projects, for example, the rings on the square with the bar next to it, and the memorial is done, it's there, and on the opposite side, those rings, they can have sort of problems. I would like to know how how you approach this technology, and how do clients see that, if it's a kind of a thing that you guys wish to go for, or do clients ask for it?
I guess it's a question about temporality or temporariness versus permanence. We did a lot of temporary projects, you know, and all the digital projects eventually break. So when someone calls us and say, you know, we want you to do an interactive piece, you know, on a permanent basis, we're a little bit wary, because how often do you replace your phone? You know, we tried to do a permanent project outdoors in DC. You know, it's been 10 years. Some of them aren't working anymore. The client's not happy. But if you left your phone outside for 10 years in the rain, you know, would that work? So there's always a kind of aspiration that they want something ephemeral and you know, high tech and interactive, but then they expect it to behave like architecture with like a 100-year sort of lifespan. So it's a real challenge to work in that mode at that scale. So now the swings are temporary. We can put them up, we can take them down. If they break, we can replace them. It's more of a kind of ephemeral condition, although it has to resist incredible, you know, abuse, you know, momentary abuse, but it's a temporary project. The memorial is more traditionally architectural. It's stones stacked on top of each other. The question of technology, you know, people say, oh, is this high tech, is it low tech? I mean, it's super low tech in its techniques. The masons that put it together actually know how to assemble stone, like a kind of Gothic cathedral. The technology that used to model it, to cut it, to configure it is completely contemporary. So in a way, you know, it's both high tech and low tech. The thing that's surprising about it is when you look at it, we're so used to seeing these forms in our computers, you know. We're used to spinning them around, and you know, but when you see it in the world, it's uncanny, because it looks like something you just saw on your computer, but it's actually in the world, made of stone. And that's kind of, it's always shocking to sort of find that uncanniness of a kind of, to use the word digital, you know, a kind of digital form in the world. It's still surprising to us.
Just one back there.
How do you go about going public when the definition of publicness is not necessarily singular? There's multiple layers of identity, demographics, and culture, like you practice internationally and domestically, and I'm just curious to how you approach this identifying the publicness when you do each project.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. I mean, I think we would argue that there's many publics, as you do, that we're sort of trying to enable multiple publics to find different voices. I think the question of rules and public sort of site specificity, I mean, Meejin was working in Korea when she was sort of inspired to think about the defensible dress, because an idea of personal space in Korea was much denser, much tighter, much closer than she was used to. I think that idea that in different cultures there are different expectations about what your personal space is, you know, that was already a kind of very clear sort of recognition of that fact. You know, when we work in the border with Mexico, there's always this question of like, well, which way should it face? Should it face south or should it face north? And, you know, which way are they coming? You know, there's a us and them. There's all these kind of difficult questions. We were hoping with a very subtle way to sort of communicate, you know, in a way beyond language, in a very, very low definition signal. So I think it's a rich topic. How do you construct publics? How do you construct, you know, common ground in public where you don't know the person's background, you don't know who's your audience, but I think we try to open up that audience as widely as possible and try to find ways to communicate and try to find ways to build behaviors, build interactions across different cultural and economic boundaries. I think we're very conscious of that identity-making role for architecture.
I also think we're always uncomfortable. You know, for almost every project we're given, what we're asked to do, You know, we always start feeling very, very uncomfortable, whether it's because we disagree with the program or disagree with the site or disagree with the context. But I think we've learned to use that discomfort in a way. Maybe this is about the role of serious play, to treat that discomfort as an opportunity to really investigate a bit further than we would have without the opportunity to have that project, or had we not done that.
I have one more question, then we'll open up to two more. You mentioned the users, and just to sort of elaborate, this is a term introduced in the 1960s in England in the context of social housing, when there was no client, but the idea was to have a kind of statistical entity, as far as I understand. So what is the difference between the kind of social engineering of, let's say, capital M modernity or modernism versus, playfully instigating behavior and codes for you?
I mean, I think we're still testing out that idea of user. I think I like your reading of it. Like, how do you imagine the subject of your architecture when they're not there at the table? They're not your client.
Right.
And I think for public work, I think you always have that position. You don't know who's going to come along and interact with your work.
But I think the answer is it's less about social engineering or kind of really constructing exactly that interaction, and then kind of versus kind of setting the stage. Yeah, setting the stage, catalyzing, and leaving some areas a little bit more open.
Right. Do we have any more questions? Oh, now there's lots of questions. Well, Amal is in the front. So that's good.
Well, it's really great work. Actually, there's a great consistency, and I like the notion of discomfort. I would have used, following on your last comment, doubt, that you can still operate with doubt. Even if you don't know, you can still put something out there, and so there's a kind of research process. And it's interesting for me that you mentioned context. It's something that I think many of us think about. How do we operate today? What is the context we're operating within? And to imagine that you can use the same rules and different contexts would, kind of would lead to sort of different outcomes. And there's this kind of sense that you put things into play and calibrate them, and so it's quite consistent. And my favorite, but I think what distinguishes also your practice is not just that you want to build, but you know how to build. I mean, you are obsessed with making, and I think that's very particular at all scales. And so when you get to that project where, sorry, it's not quite a question, but I think it's the level of intelligence to say, where this building is getting built, out there, and we're going to give a simple rule with the orientation of the brick. This comes from knowing how things are put together, and I was fascinated by this notion that you were building the model, as they were building the building. These for me are the kinds of questions we are asking. Like, how do we operate today? It's not just, okay, we have digital tools, we can create form, but we have these tools. How do we operate? How are they? New processes to make, at a distance. And I thought that was really incredible, that, this notion of setting the rules could have it's not just setting the rules, to generate a kind of formal process in the computer. It's like literally, we're gonna anyway, that was very, really, I think, quite incredible, I think. So thank you for that. Sorry, not a question, but you can answer if you want to.
We agree.
Two. So take two more.
Thank you. I watched a lecture by Meijin. I think it was MY Studio, probably in 2006, and a lot of the same issues came up. You talked about your MIT course that opened a lot of doors for you. And you said something that always stuck with me since, which was that you said that you you had a promise to yourself never to turn down a commission. And I want to know where you stand on that now, and how, like, what's the meaning of that today for you, and for both of you?
Yeah, you know, we still try never to say no, but occasionally we will pass on opportunities to our, you know, dear friends and studio
What's your email
studio
address?
mates, and but I think we still try to do any project that we think is interesting, where there is some room to innovate. And so it doesn't matter the scale for us. It doesn't really matter the budget, as long as the budget's realistic to that scale. And that's why we continue to do the temporary projects, even though it like physically and financially kills us every time we do a temporary project. But we think those are the best places to test technologies in the public and explore new ideas.
There was one right here.
Thank you for the lecture. I'm from Shanghai, and we're designing housing in our studio, so I thought this would be an interesting question to ask. It's about your 2 housing towers in Shanghai, that you give priority to kind of the inside design of the units, of the internal logic, then you kind of have this exterior shape. So you mentioned that you were not that satisfied with the shape at the beginning. So I wonder, how do you give priority to the inside logic or to the exterior form? Why, I don't know, maybe you could like design the exterior form first, then maybe put the inside logic into it?
I mean, I think if you look around Shanghai, there's so much form. I mean, every building is trying to be different, and I feel like it's a kind of nuclear arms race of like difference, like who's going to be more different than everybody else. We had never done a high-rise residential tower before, so we were kind of learning kind of type. And what we assumed about the type is that it's trying to attract different buyers, you know, and if you're selling something, you need a kind of product range. And so we thought this idea of difference and diversity and a kind of gradient of product might be appealing to the developer, but it might also have some architectural potential. So this was a hunch that we tried. And then, you know, we were given the plan. The core was set, you know, even the perimeter was set. So what we said was like, maybe we can just sort of shuffle these things around and offer this rich diversity of unit types. And we just finished the project in Chengdu. We thought, maybe there's something there. There's some sort of unit logic that would sort of transcend the whole logic. And with a couple of simple rules, we did sort of generate lots of different forms, which we then had to assess after the fact. At the end of the day, it sort of grew on us, but our initial reading was very unhappy, you know.
Uncomfortable,
Uncomfortable.
not unhappy.
You know, we're trying to figure it out too. You know, we didn't know the outcome. I guess that's the thing, you know, to be open enough to embark on a process where you don't know what the outcome is, but you might find qualities within it that you would value.
Well, that's a fantastic place to end. Thank you very much to you both for coming.